So we are on the verge of a catastrophic, spectacular Chinese collapse.
Chinese history is rich with examples of how it all falls apart in a short period of time. If I were a betting man, I think that the two most vulnerable parts of the international system right now are energy transport and food production. About 80% of the calories that humans produce are produced with at least one imported input, whether it's pesticide, fertilizer, fuel, tractors, whatever. And with the Chinese, it's more like 90%.
90% is imported.
Yeah. Well, no, not their food is imported. The inputs. The input strain. And 90% of the calories they produce are dependent upon a foreign support system. In the United States, it's less than 10. We produce most of what we need locally, and most of the rest comes from Canada. But you interrupt the food supply chain in any meaningful way, and China is only one of a host of countries that has some very real problems. Now, China faces the biggest one in absolute terms because of the size of their population. But with the Russians having their problems, the Russian space is the world's largest single supplier of fertilizer of all types. So we are already knee-deep in a fertilizer crisis globally. And we're seeing industrial accidents in the Russian space that are so big you can see them from orbit because, a lot of petroleum stuff explodes if it doesn't go right. And the Russian facility has been held together with duct tape and Western tech for a while now. That's all gone now. So China, being kind of the last man in line to get a lot of this stuff, is in a very vulnerable position. We're probably going to see about 1 million barrels a day of Russian crude fall offline within the next few weeks as part of the price cap that the Europeans are putting into place. But more important, all the insurance firms have said they're not going to deal with Russia anymore. So you're not supposed to sail at all with your ship if you don't have an insurance policy. So countries like China and India are stepping in and offering sovereign indemnifications, but that's something they've never done before. And so if there's ever a case where a ship, for whatever reason, needs to file a claim, it's going to immediately go to international arbitration because they have no method for the payout. As soon as that happens, no one's going to take an Indian insurance policy again. That's another 1 million to 2 million barrels a day that goes offline. And then all the crude that the Chinese get from eastern Siberia is from fields that the Russians never developed themselves. That was all BP. BP's gone. So we don't know how long the Russians can keep it operating, but we know it's going to go to zero. We just don't know how long it's going to take. And the Chinese are the last in line for all of this stuff. And if you have a food or an energy crisis, or God forbid, both at the same time, on top of a health crisis, on top of government incompetence, there is no way a central government holds together in that sort of environment. Like I said, Chinese history is rich with ways that can all fall apart. Oftentimes it's based on having this hyper-centralization and an incompetent leader, or incompetent leader cadre, maybe is a better way to phrase that. But how it usually goes is that the North kind of falls in on itself. It falls into famine. It falls into tyranny. You get hundreds of millions of people suffering from malnutrition and then ultimately dying. The coast goes one way, the interior kind of breaks off and shatters, and then the cities of the coast in the south, your Shanghai, your Fujian, your Guangzhou, your Hong Kong, they basically become independent city-states and integrate with foreign powers primarily in order to get food. And if you look back at the last 14 centuries, for almost that entire period until 1945, the city-states have been dependent upon foreigners to keep themselves alive. So we're really just reverting to a historical mean here. Hong Kong would probably be one of those cities that splits off. But for that to happen, you first have to have the northern section basically fall in on itself. As long as there are security services, these southern cities can't go their own way.
It's difficult to overstate just how screwed China is. If you back up to before COVID, they were the most exposed country in the world in terms of energy and food security. They get their stuff from at least a half a continent away, typically more than a continent away. And they are utterly dependent upon the U.S. Navy to keep the trade lanes open in order to access some of those materials. And then they're utterly dependent upon the Americans keeping their market open to sell their end product to. So every stage of the Chinese economic model is dependent not simply on American quiescence, but America actually empowering the Chinese system to succeed. And between the kind of disconnected populism of Trump and the more active nationalism, the kind of disconnected populism of Obama, the more active nationalism of Trump, and now the bureaucratic economic populism of Biden, every piece of the support network that keeps China going is being challenged at the same time. At the same time that the Biden administration has killed their tech sector, at the same time that they become completely dependent on Russian energy, which, whether it's coming from the West or the East, is at its peak and can only go down from here because the technical workers that are necessary to keep it going are no longer there. At the same time, their demographics have collapsed, with even the Chinese now admitting that they overcounted their population by 100 million people aged 40 and under. At the same time that Xi has completely destroyed all information reporting within the country in order to further his cult of personality. So we are on the verge of a catastrophic, spectacular Chinese collapse. There is really only two paths here. I mean, number one is in a cult of personality system where all policies start with one person. When you protest a policy, you're protesting the leader. And we saw the protests evolve in that direction in a matter of days, with people directly challenging the competence of their dear leader. If that is allowed to spin out of control, that tears the entire system down. And China has collapsed a number of times in the past because of that sort of popular uprising. Or we get a nationwide Tiananmen-style crackdown for political reasons. Neither of these outcomes is good for investment or manufacturing. And if it's the second one, anyone with a foreign link is going to be immediately seen as a security threat, and they will be treated appropriately. And again, China's history suggests that this has happened many times before as well. We're looking at the simultaneous breakdown of the German and the Chinese manufacturing systems, and they're not coming back. In the United States, assuming for the moment that we want to have stuff, North America is going to have to double the size of its industrial plant in less than 5 years. That's wildly inflationary, and it's on top of the boomers gutting the labor force from their leaving, the millennials jumping up consumption because of their age bracket, Chinese labor going away, and Russian materials going away. So we're looking at 9 to 15% inflation in the United States for the next 5 years. This is a really good story because, yes, it's going to be high inflation, but doubling the size of the industrial plant, building that out using local workforces and shorter supply chains that use less energy and have less transport, and they're closer to the end consumer. They're using the most advanced technology that is available today, integrating Mexico. This is going to be the greatest growth story in the history of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And when it's done in a few years, we will be left with the world's most productive and stable manufacturing base, and it will largely be immune to international shocks. It's not a straight road, but wow, is it a good one. Reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever you want to call it. There is not an industrial sector that has moved away from China in the last 4 years where the replacement system is less efficient than what it left. The Chinese have aged out. Their labor costs have gone up by a factor of 15 since the year 2000. They are not economically competitive in anything. And the only reason we still think of China as a manufacturing superpower is because of the admittedly large sunk cost of the investment to this point. But it's all going to be lost anyway, and it's almost all going to be lost in the next 3 years.